Yeah, thank you very much, Unnar, for the introduction, and special thanks maybe to Njörður Sigurðsson, Deputy Director of the National Archives of Iceland, for the invitation to participate in this esteemed panel, along with Laura Millar and Aðalsteinn Kjartansson. I read Laura's paper with great interest and had many immediate reactions to her vibrant call for arms. I welcome her candidness. There are indeed many things we need to be aware of in the digital age, not least of which is the quantity of information, true and false, that is produced. But as Laura reminds us, with speed and flexibility comes the risk of error, omission, and falsification, which is an extremely pressing issue in the information chaos that reigns in our post-truth world. And I find her ambition to, quote, help societies make good evidence from the beginning very admirable. I also agree with the statement that while people care about records or archives, they make assumptions about the data, the evidence, that are incorrect. To what extent that is the fault of the image archives have as places that are dusty, old, static, and stable is up for debate. I actually think most people rarely ever give it a thought, but I also think that when they do, the public perception of archives and archivists is extremely outdated. Even if the image of a static and stable archive perhaps also indicates that people trust that the data created is protected and readily available to be used as evidence. But as Laura recounted, this trust is often misplaced, and not because the archivist or the information expert is doing anything wrong, but because they're not included in the decision about the creation and preservation of potential evidence, such as the CCTV images. I also support her call for advocacy. We need to strengthen society's understanding of information and media literacy. And as a university professor of international history, I immediately started thinking about how we train our students, not only as our future colleagues as historians or archivists. Many of them will make their mark on spheres ranging from education, public administration, media, and government, but also as informed citizens with an understanding of how to recognize and analyze evidence-based truth, as Laura so nicely puts it, and I quote, "Without evidence-based truth, we open ourselves to lies, deceit, corruption, and chaos." Well, this is no small task because, as Laura also reminds us, in the post-truth world, access to authentic, reliable evidence is a grave challenge. And it is not up to any one professional group to resolve this challenge. It is the joint task of archivists, information scientists, journalists, and historians, and also we benefit from people in related fields, such as law, international and area studies, and political science, just to name a few. Now, as Unnar told you, I was trained as a historian in Iceland and the United States, but I did most of my archival work so far in Russian archives. My career as an historian has therefore forced me to be aware of the different ways democratic societies, such as Iceland, and we can count the United States among them, and authoritarian societies, such as Russia in the 21st century, treat access to records, data, and archives. Not only has this been a condition of my work as a historian, but the relationship between data, information, facts, and evidence in an authoritarian/totalitarian society has also been the topic of my research. And allow me to digress. In the aftermath of the full-scale Russian invasion of Ukraine last year, the media reached out to me multiple times to comment on the situation. Early on, I was asked during a live radio broadcast if I thought the Russian people wanted this war. And I said no. I don't think they want this war, which of course was me just answering emotionally based on what my Russian friends were saying at the time, and also based on the reality that back then we were all waiting to see, hoping really, if the time had come for the Russian people to stand up against the dictator and overthrow him. The reason this question, or rather my answer, sits with me is that I would have liked to answer very differently, albeit very academically. I wrote a whole book that was driven by the question of what people in the Soviet Union actually thought about the United States of America. Did they believe the official propaganda? Did alternative sources of information, such as foreign radio broadcasts, reach the Soviet people? And if so, did they believe what they heard there and believe it to be an alternative truth? I did extensive archival research in the Russian Federation, but as you can probably imagine, there is no archival file class entitled "What Soviet People Actually Thought About the #1 Enemy During the Cold War." So I had to be very creative in locating sources that would give me an idea of what people in totalitarian societies actually thought about their everyday lives and their position in the global world. So the sources ranged from judicial records, rehabilitation files, registered rumors, and institutional records of cultural organizations, all with their specific problems of interpretation. They all had to be analyzed not only in the context of the Cold War power struggle, but also based on the assumption that Soviet leaders feared that they would lose power if they allowed people free access to alternative sources of information, not to speak of allowing them to criticize or speak up against the Soviet regime. When we look at the current situation, we see a lot of similarity. It is dangerous to speak out against the Russian government, and therefore public opinion polls are not to be trusted. It is too complicated to go into the decade-long indoctrination that has infiltrated and set the mood in contemporary Russia, but it is worth underlining that the data this era is producing will not be useful as evidence for understanding Russian society and its reaction to the war without people who can provide the context and interpret what is presented as facts in Putin's Russia. I guess my point here is that if we think it is complicated to protect facts, evidence, and the search for truth in democratic societies, it is next to impossible, but all the more important in non-democratic societies. As I'm drawing to a close, I would like to finish my remarks by zooming in on the changing nature of power resources in the longue durée. The political scientist Joseph Nye, who is most well known for the concept of soft power, has also written about leading states and their major power resources from the 1500s until the 1900s. Much of this is familiar to those sitting here in this room. He goes from the 16th century, where Spain is in power based on colonial trade, mercenary armies, and dynastic ties. And he goes on and looks at the Netherlands in the 17th century. In 18th century, it's France with its public administration, rural industry, and army. Britain in the 19th century, where major resources are drawn from industry, political cohesion, the navy, the island location, and then the United States as the dominant power in the 20th century with economic scale, scientific and technical leadership, military forces and alliances, liberal international regimes, and universalistic culture as their major resources. When I brainstormed with my students recently about the 21st century in this context, we agreed that it is too early to talk about a leading state. It's also only with hindsight that we can talk about the United States as a leading state of the 20th century, at least if we take the Cold War and the Soviet project with its alternative modernity seriously. But it was especially striking to see what made their list of the current power resources. The students mentioned stability, and the class discussion I'm referring to was after 2014, but before 2022, if we think about the current war in Europe. They also mentioned rare minerals and water as power resources, but most commonly, they mentioned data, communication systems, and algorithms. So it's my impression that the younger generations are already worried about the potential control these categories have over our lives, and ultimately the power it gives to those in charge of these mediums. But I share the worry that not many people are able to keep up with the speed of these changes or the quantity of data that they produce, let alone imagine how contemporary data becomes future evidence, as Laura is reminding us of. Again, I thank you very much for an inspiring talk, Laura. I look forward to hearing Aðalstein's remarks, and I hope we can discuss with the audience how to help societies make good evidence from the beginning. I doubt we can come up with solutions that will provide Russians with reliable data and evidence, but perhaps we can start with what we can do in Iceland, and in particular, how historians, professors, archivists, and journalists can work together to build evidence literacy, a term I like very much, in the 21st century. Thank you.